Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. This is Viswa Pragya. It's been a while since I did a live session, so I just want to first make sure that the mechanics of it are all working okay. Looks like I'm audible. I'm able to hear myself, so I think good to go. So the next important thing is quickly to talk about. Okay, why was there a break in between? If 2025 was a tough year, 2026 is going to be even tougher, right? We're all human beings and we have challenges. So either way, here I am. So without much further ado, the idea is to really get into finishing this book that we started long time back, and we are on session 27. We have done 26 sessions so far, and we have covered so many different topics that it's been a very interesting journey, to say the least. Now, that said, uh, today's topic is no less interesting than any of the previous topics. In fact, it's one of my favorite topics, human psychology, or at least the modern psychology. Not because I find it interesting to give answers to some of the questions, but there is a significant portion of the Western world that still uh, subscribes to the frameworks that this gentleman came up with. So it's important for us to know how they look at the world, what the Western lens of the human psychology is. So, and it would be remiss of me to say anything about Freud without saying that we might see some psychopathy in the session itself, basically. Right. So hopefully it will be a peaceful session without any interruptions. I'll get through the chapter and then we'll close it. If anybody is listening to it now or sometime later, please, if you have any questions, ask them in the comments today or at a later time, and then I'll try to respond to the best of my knowledge. I am by no means a psychologist or an expert in Freudian moorings, so to speak. Okay, so without delay, here we go. So, Sophie's World by Jostein Gaarder, session 27. Today's topic is Freud. And the one liner that Jostein put here is the odious egoistic impulse that had emerged in her. That in itself is a sentence and a half. So we'll slowly get into how to unpack this statement as we get through the chapter. Hilda Mahler-Nag jumped out of bed with the bulky ring binder in her arms. She plunked it down on her writing desk, grabbed her clothes, and dashed into the bathroom. She stood under the shower for 2 minutes, dressed herself quickly, and ran downstairs. Right? So here is this gal. Oh, Dawji, welcome back. Thank you, sir. If you want to participate in the session, I'll give you the link here. You can always come and sit in the session. Okay, so breakfast is ready. Hilda, who said this? Her mom said this, right? And let's see. Okay, so her mom says, "Welcome. Sorry, breakfast is ready, Hilda." So Hilda says, "I just have to go and draw first." So the kid is, she wants to do something else. So the mom is trying to rationalize with her, but Hilda, too late. She's gone already. She ran out of the house, down the garden, and out onto the little dock. She untied the boat and jumped down into it. She rowed around the bay with short, angry strokes until she had calmed down. We are the living planet, Sophie. We are the great vessels sailing around a burning sun in the universe. But each and every of us is also a ship sailing through life with a cargo of genes. When we have carried this cargo safely to the next harbor, we have not lived in vain. Again, talk about a sentence and a half. This is it, right? Look how beautifully the author has put it, right? I'll read it one more time. We are the living planet, Sophie. We are the great vessel. She's referring to Earth, obviously. sailing around a burning sun in the universe. But each and every of us is also a ship sailing through life with a cargo of genes. When we have carried this cargo safely to the next harbor, obviously they are talking about progeny, we have not lived in vain. Okay. She knew the passage by heart. It had been written for her, not for Sophie, but for Hilda, for her. Every word in the ring binder was written by Dad to Hilda. Okay. What a beautiful message. She rested the oars in the oarlocks and drew them in. The boat rocked gently on the water, the ripples slapping softly against the prow. All right. And like the little rowboat floating on the surface in the bay at Lil Sand, she herself was just a nutshell on the surface of life. Again, the tying of the mundane to the profound, basically. Beautifully done. And that's what you expect when you read philosophy, right? You're trying to make, trying to draw big analogies, right? In philosophy, it's very important to understand through analogy, basically, right? Don't get stuck in the mundane. Mundane is just an example of the profound or the transcendent or transcendental, rather. Okay, where were Sophie and Alberto in this picture? Yes, where were Alberto and Sophie? She could not fathom. Basically, she suddenly realized how little and how small her existence is. She could not fathom that they were no more than electromagnetic impulses in her father's brain. Okay, so there is this other idea in this book that says that the characters Sophie and Alberto and all these are also just characters in a book. So what if we as human beings are also characters in some play or some book? That's a thought that this book also tries to bring forward. He could not fathom and certainly not accept that they were only paper and printer's ink from a ribbon in her father's portable typewriter. One might just as well say that she herself was nothing but a conglomeration of protein compounds that had suddenly come to life one day in a hot little pool, right? They're referring to that primordial or primeval earth where everything was a hot boiling soup, right? Chemical soup, and suddenly sentience came into being. Okay. But unfortunately, not everybody subscribes to this philosophy, especially the Indians. Anyway, we have our own way of looking at it. But she was more than that. She was Hilda Moller Mack. And here is the subjective experience that human beings go through, right? The subjective experience that makes us all unique and our experiences unique at the same time, right? Not just some pieces of ink or drops of ink on somebody's typewriter. Okay. She had to admit that the ring binder was a fantastic present and that her father had touched the core of something eternal in her. Wow. But she didn't care for the way he was dealing with Sophie and Alberto. All right. She would certainly teach him a lesson even before he got home. She felt she owed it to the two of them. Hilda could already imagine her father at Kastrup Airport in Copenhagen. She could just see him running around like mad. Hilda was now quite herself again, so her anger was let out and then she's feeling better. She rowed the boat back to the dock where she was careful to make it fast. After breakfast, so she went home and she had her breakfast that her mom was saying she should have. After breakfast, she sat at the table for a long time with her mother. Felt good to be able to talk about something as ordinary as whether the egg was a trifle too soft. Again, switching between the mundane and the transcendental is something that we have to do every day, right? That is what even the Indian Tattva Vichara is all about, right? The mundane leads to the transcendental. So you cannot just sit and keep thinking about the transcendental. You might just get lost, right? But if you focus only on the mundane, um, the entire life experience will not be without that extra dimension that we all have in us. Actually, the idea is to find it within us. Okay, she did not start reading until the evening. There were not many pages left now. Yep, that's exactly right. We don't have too many pages left either in this book. All right. Once again, there was a knocking on the door. So now Sophie has opened the book and she started reading it. Let's just put our hands over our ears, said Alberto, and perhaps it'll go away. No, I want to see who it is. Right? So Sophie wants to open the door. Alberto followed her to the door. On the step stood a naked man. He had adopted a very ceremonial posture, but the only thing he had with him was the crown on his head. All right. Well, he said, what do you good people think of the emperor's new clothes? So, you should know this story about the emperor's new clothes. There was this French emperor that two tailors wanted to make fun of him. So they basically said they're going to make clothes with a thread that is so fine that nobody can see it, right? And then essentially the people surrounding the king were all yes men. The king liked the idea and then they could not say no to him because they were afraid of falling out of favor with the king. So eventually the tailors come back with nothing and then they pretend that they are clothing the king with that nothing. And everybody goes along with the story because nobody can say no to the king until there's a little boy in the crowd. So the king comes out with his new clothes. The emperor comes out with his new clothes, right? And he's naked basically. There's no clothes. And then everybody is saying nothing. The entire population is there watching him like parade around naked until a little boy says, "Hey, the emperor has no clothes," right? So somebody who is as innocent at the same time has no consequences has got to call out sometimes that the reality is what it is and not what people are pretending it to be rather. Okay. So that's what this naked man was asking. What do you good people think of the emperor's new clothes? Alberto and Sophie were utterly dumbfounded. This caused the naked man some consternation, right? What? You're not bowing, he cried. Indeed, that is true, said Alberto, but the emperor is stark naked. The naked man maintained his ceremonial posture, right? Alberto bent over and whispered in Sophie's ear. He thinks he is respectable. At this, the man scowled. Is some kind of censorship being exercised on these premises? He asked. Regrettably, said Alberto. That means yes, it is. In here, we are both alert and of sound mind in every way. The emperor's shameless condition. In the emperor's shameless condition, he can therefore not cross the threshold of this house. Sophie found the naked man's pomposity so absurd that she burst out laughing. As if her laughter had been a prearranged signal, the man with the crown on his head suddenly became aware that he was naked. Right? So the laughter brought about the awareness. Interesting. Covering his private parts with both hands, he bounded towards the nearest clump of trees and disappeared, probably to join the company with Adam and Eve, Noah, Little Red Riding Hood, and Winnie the Pooh. Right? Like all these, like so. There's a Louis Carroll angle here, Alice in the Wonderland style, right? So there's always a character that appears, and then they play some kind of part, and then they leave, right? Even before there were all these Riding Hoods and Winnie the Poohs that appeared in this paper to Sophie and Albert. So today it was this emperor with no clothes. Alberto and Sophie remained standing on the step laughing. At last, Alberto said, it might be a good idea if we went inside. I'm going to tell you about Freud and his theory of the unconscious. All right. So we are getting into Freud. They seated themselves by the window again. Sophie looked at her watch and said, it's already 2:30, and I have a lot to do before the garden party. So have I. Well, just a few words about Sigmund Freud, said Alberto. All right. Was he a philosopher? Sophie asked. We could describe him as a cultural philosopher, at least, right? Freud was born in 1856 and he studied medicine at the University of Vienna, right? Austria, we are talking about. He lived in Vienna for the greater part of his life at a period when the cultural life of the city was flourishing. So Vienna was indeed a very bustling sort of cultural hub for Europe for quite some time. He specialized early on in neurology. Towards the close of the last century and far into our own, he developed his, in quotes, depth psychology or psychoanalysis. Okay, remember this term psychoanalysis. It exists till today and is a flourishing field. You're going to explain this, right? Asked Sophie. Yes, psychoanalysis is a description of the human mind in general, as well as a therapy for nervous and mental disorders. I do not intend to give you a complete picture either of Freud or his work. but his theory of the unconscious is necessary to understand of what a human being is. This is again a Western approach. You want to understand what a human being's mind is all about, or what the uh, how the unconscious mind of a man or person, woman, man works. If you want to understand that, there is a strong belief in the Western world that you have to understand the basic framework in this day and age is still Freud, right? I mean, there are many challengers and also uh, people who challenged Freud's theories and all that. But nevertheless, Freud is a milestone in the Western world. Right? Just checking to see if the audio is coming through. All right, good. We are good. It's loud and clear. Okay. All right. You intrigue me, said Sophie. Go on. Freud held that there is a constant tension between man and his surroundings, in particular, a tension or conflict between his drives and needs and the demands of the society. This is no exaggeration to it is no exaggeration to say that Freud discovered human drives. This makes him an important exponent of the naturalistic currents that were so prominent towards the end of the 19th century. Right? Remember, when was Freud born? 1856. All right, smack in the middle of the 19th century or the beginning of it. What do you mean by human drives? Our actions are not always guided by reason. Man is not really such a rational creature as the 18th century rationalists like to think. Irrational impulses often determine what we think, what we dream, and what we do. Such irrational impulses can be an expression of basic drives or needs. For example, the human sexual drive, for example, is just as basic as the baby's instinct to suckle. So Sophie is intrigued, more intrigued now. Yes, she is. She wants him to continue. Okay, Albert is continuing. This in itself was no new discovery, but Freud showed that these basic needs can be disguised or sublimated, thereby steering our actions without our being aware of it. So, as in, the expression of this basic need can be covered or can be veiled by either societal norms or talk it talk of say culture or some kind of other expression that doesn't quite tie back to the basic need, right? Thereby steering our actions without our being aware of it. So we do something thinking that we are doing that because of a particular reason. We are doing Y because of X, but the real reason is not X. There is some other P or Q somewhere else. Basically, that's Freud's core philosophy. He also showed that infants have some sort of sexuality, right? The respectable middle class Viennese reacted with abhorrence, that means absolute disgust, hatred, to this suggestion of the sexuality of the child and made him very unpopular. So people thought he was some kind of a psycho himself, basically. Right? Something is wrong with Freud. So Sophie is saying that she's not surprised. I'm not surprised, says Sophie. We call it Victorianism. All right. So now the uh, full frame, rigid way of looking at things is the opposite of it, or the um, uh, antithesis of it, Victorianism, basically. We call it Victorianism when everything to do with sexuality is taboo. Okay, remember this, it's very important. So, whatever this sexuality is taboo is not necessarily a an Indian concept, for example, right? It is a Victorian concept that was uh, sort of exchanged, let's say, right? Rather than, let's not use very strong terms like imposed and all that. Probably it was, but nevertheless, it was exchanged from the Western world to the Eastern world. Freud first became aware of children's sexuality during his practice of psychotherapy. So he had an empirical basis for his claims. So empirical means real evidence, right? Observable evidence. So that's what Freud thought he had. He also had seen, at least that's what Jostein is saying, the author is saying. He had also seen how numerous forms of neurosis or psychological disorders could be traced, excuse could be traced. He had also seen how numerous forms of neurosis or psychological disorders could be traced back to conflicts during childhood. All right, now we are getting into Freud, really. He gradually developed a type of therapy that we could all call the archaeology of the soul. So what do? You actually become an archaeologist of the experiences or the mind or the soul in the Western parlance. And then you take the person back, right? You take them back into their childhood to unpack the childhood experiences and then tie them back to what they're experiencing currently in order to cure or in order to alleviate neurosis or neurotic or psychotic behaviors. So Sophie is now completely, she wants more details to understand what it is. So Sophie says, what do you mean by that? So what is this archaeology of the soul? An archaeologist searches for traces of the distant past by digging through layers of cultural history. He may find a knife from the 18th century. Deeper in the ground, he may find a comb from the 14th century, and even deeper down, perhaps, an urn from the 5th century BC. Yes? So Sophie wants more details. In a similar way, the psychoanalyst, right, Freudian psychoanalyst, with the patient's help, can dig deep into the patient's mind and bring to light the experiences that have caused the patient's psychological disorder. Since, according to Freud, we store the memory of all our experiences deep inside us. So today, one of the terms that's being thrown around quite a bit is this whole trauma. Oh, there's trauma, right? It comes from the same body of work, psychoanalysis, basically, right? And if you want to really see a sort of a parody about psychoanalysis, there used to be this show back in the day, in the 90s, called Frasier, which was actually an offshoot from another sitcom that was very early days, 1970s sitcom called Cheers, basically, right? So there is this guy called Fraser Crane who is a PhD in psychoanalysis, and then he keeps analyzing the sort of behaviors of everybody around in the show, while at the same time his life is in a bit of a mess. Okay, so essentially, you can dig deep into the patient's mind to bring to light the experiences that have caused the patient's psychological disorder. So even to characterize something as disorder and then to sort of put it in the bucket that it is a psychosis or a neurosis, and then peeling back the layers to say this is what caused it. Some people say this is all voodoo science. Nevertheless, some people swear by it. Okay, so if he's saying, yes, I see. The analyst can perhaps discover an unhappy experience that the patient has tried to suppress for many years, but which has nevertheless lain buried, gnawing away at the patient's resources, right? That it's been eating them from inside without the patient's knowledge. It's all in the subconscious. By bringing a, in quotes, traumatic experience into the conscious mind and holding it up to the patient, so to speak, he or she can help the patient be done with it and get well again. So you uncover the trauma and then you get the patient to look at it, right? Once you look at it, the patient might be able to figure out, or be either you figure out that you are this is what is causing it and then you get over it, or you make peace with it because now you look at it and say you cannot do anything about it, right? So either way, it's some kind of a thing that is, it's like something under the bed that is causing uh, uh, the patient or the person to not be able to fall asleep. So you remove the bed, you see what's underneath, you remove that obstacle, put the bed back, and then you are able to sleep. So it's something like that, right? That sounds logical, says Sophie. But I'm jumping too far ahead. Let's first take a look at Freud's description of the human mind. Yes. So there is a framework, there's a psychoanalytical framework that Freud proposed. So now Alberto is going into that. Have you ever seen a newborn baby? Asked Alberto. So Sophie says, I have a cousin who's 4. When we come into the world, so Alberto is saying, when we come into the world, we live out our physical and mental needs quite directly and unashamedly. If we do not get milk, we cry, or maybe we cry if we have a wet diaper. We also give direct expression to our desire for physical contact and body warmth. All right. Freud called this pleasure principle. He called this pleasure principle in us the id. Okay. So this id is a very important thing in psychoanalysis, right? So it is the pleasure principle or the hunger principle, something that is uh, very basic in the sense that you're hungry, you feel hungry, you want food, right? You feel thirsty, you want water, that kind of stuff, basically, right? So that is that instinct or that drive, the thing that drives that, right? The pleasure principle or the pain principle or the hunger principle in us is called the id. Okay, as newborn babies, we are hardly anything but id. So when a baby is just born, right, less than 6 months old, all they want to do is to have not have a wet diaper, to be well fed, and then they sleep, right? That is the id, the newborn baby, basically, right? No appearances or no pretensions, no cultural coverings, right? No manners, no none of that stuff. Right? Go on, said Sophie. We carry the id or the pleasure principle with us into adulthood and throughout life. But gradually, we learn to regulate our desires and to adjust to our surroundings. Right? We learn to regulate the pleasure principle in relation to the reality principle. Okay. In Freud's terms, we develop an ego which has this regulative function. Even though we want or need something, we cannot just lie down and scream until we get what we want or need. No, obviously, says Sophie. We may desire something very badly that the outside world will not accept. We may repress our desires. That means we try to push them away and forget about them. Okay? So the ego is the one that regulates the id, basically. Okay. So as you grow, you develop this ego that's going to help you to deal with the reality. Okay, I want water, but I may not get it because I'm in the middle of nowhere. So you tell yourself, okay, as soon as I get to some civilization, let's say you're lost somewhere, then the first thing I'm going to do is go to a gas station or go to a grocery store and then get some water and drink. Right. So the id is saying you're thirsty, but the ego is telling the id in your own mind, just hang on. When the time is right, your thirst will be satisfied. Okay? Or you cannot just grab somebody else drinking water. You cannot just grab it and drink it. Right? You got to follow the norms of the society. So Sophie says yes, no, sorry, no, obviously, right? You cannot just scream until you get one. Then Alberto is saying we may desire something very badly that the outside world will not accept. We may repress our desires. That means we try to push them away and forget about them. So Sophie says, I see. However, Freud proposed and worked with a third element in the human mind. Okay, now enter a third element. From intimacy, we are constantly faced with the moral demands of our parents and of our society. Okay. When we do anything wrong, our parents say, don't do that, or naughty, naughty, that's bad. Even when we are grown up, we retain the echo of such moral demands and judgments. It seems as though the world's moral expectations have become part of us. Okay. Freud called this the superego. All right. So all three are on the table now. So you got the ego, you got the superego, and you got the id. Okay. So superego is something that you are being constantly demanded to aspire to. Okay. Okay. So from the childhood, you have to become an engineer, you have to become a doctor, right? Or you have to write a test and pass. You have to become very good at academics. You have to study well. You have to get good ranks, competition, performance, right? So all this is the super ego that is developing in you, or the parents are trying to inject. So in quotes, the values or whatever that the parents or the society is trying to inject inside you to be accepted and to be seen as a good citizen becomes part of you. And that is your superego. That is called the superego, according to the Freudian psychoanalysis. So you got the id, that is the child in us, the newborn in us, instinctively being driven to things like hunger, thirst, etc. Then you have the superego, the society's demands that became part of you, aspirational demands, right? And as you become an adult, you also look at role models and say, I want to become like that person. Even that is part of the superego. And then there is the ego. That is the reality principle that says, okay, I have these instincts, I have these aspirations. There is a bridge between the two. There is a broker between the two. And that is your ego, basically. All right, good. Excuse me. So Sophie is asking, is that another word for conscience? Conscience is a component of the superego, Alberto says. But Freud claimed that the superego tells us when our desires themselves are bad or improper or not least in the case of erotic and sexual. Um, okay. But Freud claimed that the superego tells us when our desires themselves are bad or improper. Okay, not least in the case of erotic or sexual desire. And this is an important point, right? So the superego is also the. So she asked conscience, right? That's the question that Sophie asked. Uh, but here, Alberto is saying, well, it's not just conscience, but it is also the scale or the value system that you have inside you that tells you what is right and what is wrong, right? So there are two parts to being a human being, right? Knowing how to do something right, as in I want to do something, I want to cook something, I should know how to do it. But there's also another aspect of it, which is what I'm doing right or not? And that's a moral or ethical question, right? And most people have a compass within us depending upon our early exposure in life, the way the superego is formed, basically. Okay, so that is the ethical framework or the scale or the barometer that tells you as a human being whether you are doing the right thing or not, right? You may screw up a dish, right? Like, for example, cooking something, you may screw it up because you don't know how to do it. That is how to do things, but whether to do it or not, right? So that is a very important barometer or ethical compass that everybody develops eventually as an adult. And here, Alberto is saying, for example, in the case of erotic or sexual desire, like for example, very simply put, right? So there are certain rules, right? You cannot marry your sister, or you cannot desire your mother, that kind of stuff, basically, you know, in an erotic manner. And that is a compass that most of us develop as adults eventually when we get into adulthood. And so that's what Alberto is referring to. And as I said, Freud claimed that the improper desires already manifest themselves at an early stage of childhood. Okay, so this is important to know, right? The whole of the import or the purport of Freud's framework, actually going back to the childhood part, is Freud said even this erotic, so he focused on the erotic or the sexual desire, right? And then he said this develops in the very early childhood, and that's what a lot of people found objection to, basically. Okay, because child as young as 3 or 5 years old, Freud imposes this sexual desire angle on top of them, right, on top of the human mind, and then he draws conclusions, right, and we'll get to see what Jostein is putting in this book, right, because you can go ad nauseum about it. Okay, so Sophie is saying, let me read the paragraph one more time. I gave too much commentary, and then we'll keep going faster. Conscience is a component. So Sophie asked the previous question: is that another word for conscience? So she meant the superego. Conscience is a component of the superego. So superego is more than conscience. But Freud claimed that the superego tells us when our desires themselves are bad or improper, not least in the case of erotic or sexual desire. And as I said, Freud claimed that these improper desires already manifest themselves at an early stage of childhood. So Sophie says, how? Nowadays, we know that infants like touching their sex organs. We can observe this on any beach. In Freud's time, this behavior could result in a slap over the fingers of the 2 or 3 year old, perhaps accompanied by the mother saying, naughty, or don't do that. Keep your hands on top of the covers, right? That's what moms in the past would say. How sick, says Sophie. That's the beginning of guilt feelings about everything connected with the sex organs and sexuality. Because this guilt feeling remains in the superego, many people, okay, according to Freud, please underline this. This is all Freud, okay? Many people, according to Freud, in fact, most people feel guilty about sex all their lives, okay? At the same time, he showed that sexual desires and needs are natural and vital for human beings. And thus, my dear Sophie, the stage is set for a lifelong conflict between desire and guilt. Welcome to Freudian psychoanalysis. Okay. Don't you think the conflict has died down a lot since Freud's time? Right. So Sophie is trying to ask, are we not a little bit more liberated in this day and age than during Freud's time? So Alberto is expounding a little bit more. Most certainly. But many of Freud's patients experience the conflict so acutely that they developed what Freud called as neurosis. So this acute feeling of the conflict between guilt and desire was so strong in some patients that neurosis means repetitive behaviors, doing something like ticks, for example, right? Suddenly the jaws clench for some people, they make sounds, right? Those kinds of things, the physical manifestation of it, not just in the mind. Freud claimed that this this desire and guilt uh, tension or the conflict manifested itself physically, the neurosis. One of his many women patients, for example, excuse me, was secretly in love with her brother-in-law, and her sister died of an illness. She thought, now he is free to marry me. This thought was on course for a frontal collision with her superego, right? Excuse, excuse me. She knew that it was wrong or whatever. Internally, there is an ethical compass saying this is wrong, right? Just give me 1 second. Okay. So now he is free to marry me. This thought was on course for a frontal collision with her superego and was so monstrous an idea that she immediately repressed it, Freud tells us. In other words, she buried it deep in her unconscious. Freud wrote, the young girl was ill and displaying severe hysterical symptoms. Okay, these are all Freud's notes. He notes about his um, patient. Okay, Freud wrote, the young girl was ill and displaying severe hysterical symptoms, the symptoms of hysteria, basically. When I began treating her, it appeared that she had thoroughly forgotten about the scene at her sister's bedside and the odious egoistic impulse, back to the original statement, right? Odious egoistic impulse that had emerged in her. But during analysis, she remembered it, and in a state of great agitation, she reproduced the pathogenic moment, and through this treatment became cured. All right. So the odious egoistic impulse was reenacted in Freud's office. A lady came for treatment of this neurosis, and then Freud took her back to the time when her sister died, and on the bedside, this strong desire for her brother-in-law came out, and she reenacted it. Right? She remembered it. She reproduced the pathogenic movement. Pathos means disease, basically, right? The disease-generating movement, and or the moment that got generated because of the pathos, and this treatment became, and because of this treatment, she became cured apparently. Okay. Now I better understand what you meant by an archaeology of the soul, Sophie says, with what little she could understand. So we can give a general description of the human psyche, right? Psyche means our subconscious and the conscious brain. After many years of experience in treating patients, Freud concluded that the conscious constitutes only a small part of the human mind, right? There's a lot more going on in our subconscious, right? The conscious is like the tip of the iceberg above the sea level. Below the sea level or below the threshold of the conscious is the subconscious or the unconscious. So Sophie is asking. So the unconscious is everything that's inside us that we have forgotten and don't remember. Alberto is answering. We don't have all our experiences consciously present all the time. But the kinds of things we have thought or experienced and which we can recall if we put our mind to it, Freud termed the preconscious. He reserved the term unconscious for things that we have repressed. That is the sort of thing we have made an effort to forget because it was either unpleasant, improper, or nasty. If we have desires and urges that are not tolerable to the conscious, the superego shoves them downstairs. Away with them, the superego says. Sophie is saying, I get it. I don't know how much she got it because it's not that easy to get this like in one sitting. Anyway, this mechanism is at work in all healthy people. So that you get the desire, there is an impulse in your mind. You don't know where it comes from, but it comes. Immediately, the superego is the filter or the gatekeeper, right, in your mind. So the gatekeeper says, hey, this is a garbage idea, and then pushes it down the stairs. Take it away from your immediate thought process. The thought comes, the thought goes, basically, right? Superego pushes it away, and then you don't do anything about it. Okay, so that is the role of the superego. Okay, this mechanism is at work in all healthy people, by the way. No, not neurosis, psychosis, any of that thing. These are all the healthy people. The superego works like this. That's what Freud is saying. But it can be such a tremendous strain for some people to keep the unpleasant or forbidden thoughts away from consciousness that it leads to mental illness. Okay. So there's a very strong thought that is coming. The superego is saying push it away. But the thought keeps coming. And there is so much conflict between this thought and the superego that you become sick. You become mentally ill. Whatever is repressed in this way will try of its own accord to re-enter the consciousness. For some people, it takes a great effort to keep such impulses under the critical eye of the conscious. When Freud was in America in 1909, lecturing on psychoanalysis, he gave an example of the way this repression mechanism functions. So Sophie says, I'd like to hear that. Let's see what Freud has to say. He said, suppose that here in this hall and in this audience, whose exemplary stillness and attention I cannot sufficiently commend, there is an individual who is creating a disturbance. And by his ill-bred laughing, talking, by scraping his feet, distracts my attention from my task. I explain that I cannot go on with my lecture under these conditions, and thereupon several strong men among you get up and after a short struggle eject the disturber of the peace from the hall. He is now repressed and I can continue my lecture. But in order that that disturbance may not be repeated, in case the man who has just been thrown out attempts to force his way back into the room, the gentlemen who have executed my suggestion take their chairs to the door and establish themselves there as a resistance to keep up the repression. Now, if you transfer both locations to the psyche, calling this consciousness and the outside the unconscious, you have a tolerably good illustration of the process of our repression, basically. So it's a thought that you have eliminated from the room, and now you are keeping it there through some kind of very strong security, right? And um, if you transfer this location to the psyche, that's what he's saying. The outside is the unconscious, and the room is the conscious, basically. And there are ideas that have been thrown out of the conscious to be kept outside the room. So Sophie says, I agree. But the disturber of the peace insists on re-entering. Sophie, at least that's the way it is with repressed thoughts and urges. So just give me 2 second break. Okay, so back. So, but the disturber of the peace insists on re-entering, Sophie. At least that's the way it is with repressed thoughts and urges. We live under the constant pressure of repressed thoughts that they are trying to fight their way up from the unconscious. That's why we often say or do things without intending to. Okay, unconscious reactions thus prompt our feelings and actions. So the unconscious is always trying to re-enter the room, right? So we are always saying things sometimes that we are not conscious of because the unconscious is guiding or it is making us react. Can you give me an example? Freud operates with several of these mechanisms. One is what he called the parapraxis, slips of the tongue or pen. In other words, we accidentally say or do things that we once tried to repress. Freud gives the example of the shop foreman who was to propose a toast to the boss. The trouble was that this boss was terribly unpopular. In plain words, he was what one might call a swine. Swine, you know what swine means. Swine is a pig. Yes, Sophie says. The foreman stood up, raised his glass, and said, here is to the swine. So Sophie says, I'm speechless. So was the foreman. He had actually only said what he really meant, but he didn't mean to say it. Do you want to hear another example, Sophie? Sophie says, yes, please. A bishop who was coming to tea with the local minister, who had a large family of nice, well behaved little daughters. This bishop happened to have an unusually big nose. The little girls were duly instructed that on no account were they to refer to the bishop's nose, since children often blurt out spontaneous remarks about people because their repressive mechanism is not yet developed. The bishop arrived, and the delightful daughters strained themselves to the utmost not to comment on his nose. They tried to not even look at it and to forget about it. Repression, repression. But they were thinking about it the whole time. And then one of them was asked to pass the sugar around. She looked at the distinguished bishop and said, "Do you take sugar in your nose?" So instead of saying, "Do you take sugar in your coffee or tea or whatever?" she said, "Do you take sugar in your nose?" So because nose was right there at the doorstep in her unconscious, repressed or subconscious. As soon as some activity happened, the door opened and that thought came straight up, right up front. How awful, said Sophie. Another thing we can do is to rationalize. That means that we do not have the real reason for what we are doing either to ourselves or to other people because the real reason is unacceptable. We do not give the real reason, right? So instead of giving the real reason, we rationalize. Like what? Said Sophie. I could hypnotize you to open a window. While you are under hypnosis, I tell you that when I begin to drum my fingers on the table, you will get up and open the window. I drum on the table and you open the window. Afterward, I ask you why you opened the window, and you might say, you did it because it was too hot. But that is not the real reason. You are reluctant to admit to yourself that you did something under my hypnotic orders. So you rationalize. Rationalizing means hiding the real reason and then giving some kind of an explanation that seems more plausible or acceptable. Okay. So you are giving a reason, but that's not the real reason. But you are giving it to make the reason sound or appear rational, basically. That's what is called rationalizing. Yes, I see, says Sophie. We all encounter that sort of thing practically every day. This 4-year old cousin of mine, I don't think he has a lot of playmates, so he's always happy when I visit. One day I told him I had to hurry home to my mom. You know what he said? What did he say? He said she's stupid. Yes, that was definitely a case of rationalizing. The boy didn't mean what he actually said. He meant it was stupid, you had to go. But he was too shy to say so. Another thing we do is project. So that is rationalizing. Project. So now she's asking about what projection is. Okay. So what is that? Asked Sophie. When we project, we transfer the characteristics we are trying to repress in ourselves onto other people. A person who is very miserly, for example, will characterize others as penny pinchers. And someone who will not admit to being preoccupied with sex can be the first one to be incensed at other people's sex fixation. So this is like a repressed idea. We have it ourselves. But when somebody is actually doing something, instead of trying to find out what that person's real reason is, we project our reason onto them, right? Because we have no better explanation, right? It's called projection. People do it all the time. So Sophie says, Freud claimed that everyday life was filled with unconscious mechanisms like these. We forget a particular person's name. We fumble with our clothes while we talk, or we shift what appear to be random objects around the room. We also stumble over words and make various slips of the tongue or pen that can seem completely innocent. Freud's point was that these slips are neither as accidental nor as innocent as we think. These bungled actions can, in fact, reveal the most intimate secrets. Yeah, nowadays there is this whole topic of this whole body language, that this and all that was rooted in this same thing. All these Freud's theories of, hey, why did this happen, why did that happen, and then you start coming up with reasons using this framework. From now on, I'll watch all my words very carefully. Even if you do, you won't be able to escape from your unconscious impulses. The art is precisely not to expend too much effort on buying unpleasant things in the unconscious, burying unpleasant things in the unconscious. So the idea is, don't repress too many, but at the same time, that makes the society what it is today, right? It's going in a different direction because nobody wants to repress anything. So they have been conditioned to think that if you repress an idea, it will come back to you anyway. So you might as well just not repress it. And the next thing you know, you go the other way. Right? There's no repression, and then it's a free for all. People have to think: is that a good society to live in? The art is precisely not to expend too much effort. So you have to expend a little bit of effort. What is little bit? What is too much? God knows. It's like trying to block up the entrance to a water vole's nest. You can be sure that the water vole will pop up in another part of the garden. It's actually quite healthy to leave the door ajar between the conscious and the unconscious. That's what Alberto is saying. If you lock that door, you can get mentally sick, right? That's what Sophie asked. Yes, a neurotic is just such a person who uses too much energy trying to keep the unpleasant out of his, consciousness. Frequently, there is a particular experience which the person is desperately trying to express. He can nonetheless be anxious for the doctor to help him to find his way back to the hidden traumas. Right? How does the doctor do that? Freud developed a technique which he called free association. Excuse me. In other words, he let the patient lie in a relaxed position and just talk about whatever came to his or her mind, however irrelevant, random, unpleasant, or embarrassing it might sound. The idea was to break through the lid or control that had grown over the traumas, because it was these traumas that were causing the patient concern. They were active all the time, not just consciously. Okay. The harder you try to forget something, the more you think about it unconsciously, right? That's what Sophie is asking. Exactly. That's why it's important to be aware of the signals from our unconscious. Unconscious. According to Freud, the royal road to unconscious is our dreams. Enter the dream situation, right? So the dream interpretation, right? So this whole idea that the gateway to our unconscious is the dream is also another of Freud's framework things. According to Freud, the royal road to the unconscious is our dreams. His main work was written on this subject. The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900. Yes, if you are really interested in understanding how Freud went about his business, this is a seminal book. Okay, The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1900, no less. People swear by it even today. I know some of my friends do that, right? They talk about it all the time, and then it's a worldview basically in itself, in which he showed that our dreams are not random. Our unconscious tries to communicate with our conscious through dreams. Okay, go on, says Sophie. After many years of experience with patients, and not least after having analyzed his own dreams, Freud determined that all dreams are wish fulfillments. This is clearly observable in children, he said. They dream about ice cream and cherries. But in adults, the wishes that are to be fulfilled in dreams are disguised. This is because even when we sleep, censorship is at work on what we will permit ourselves. And although this censorship or repression mechanism is considerably weaker when we are asleep than when we are awake, it is still strong enough to cause our dreams to distort the wishes we cannot acknowledge, which is why dreams have to be interpreted. Exactly, right? So it's not like you are going to get a dream that is vivid, that'll give you all the answers. Even in the dreams, the filtering mechanism is there. The superego is at work. So you'll have to interpret the dreams to figure out, to dig out the basic repressions, the basic desires that are trying to express themselves through the dreams. So Sophie says, which is why the dreams have to be interpreted. And the other reason is Freud also has to make some money, right, for his practice, which is why he came up with his interpretation. That's my opinion. Freud showed that we must distinguish between the actual dream as we recall it in the morning and the real meaning of the dream, right? That's why he never went out of business. Even now, if you are able to become a dream expert, your life is set. Because it's all interpretation. There's no, you know, it's a story that you weave around what somebody tells you. He termed the actual dream image, that is, the film or video we dream, the manifest dream. This apparent dream content always takes its material or scenario from the previous day. But the dream also contains a deeper meaning, which is hidden from our consciousness. Freud called this the latent dream thought. So there is an apparent dream and a latent dream. And these hidden thoughts, which the dream is really about, may stem from the distant past, from the earliest childhood, for instance. So we have to analyze the dream before we can understand it. Yes. And for the mentally ill, this must be done in conjunction with the therapist. Enter the therapist, enter the practice, enter the money. But it is not the doctor who interprets the dream. He can only do it with the help of the patient. In this situation, the doctor simply fulfills the function of a Socratic midwife. Okay. Jostein, I tip my hat to Jostein for coming up with all these terms. So I believe there is a Socratic midwife that delivers the thought using Socratic logic or whatever that is, the Socratic method, cause and effect. assisting during the interpretation. So you have to interact with the patient, talk to the patient, etc., 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 and you have to play the role of a Socratic midwife to deliver the real interpretation, the latent dream, basically. I see, says Sophie. The actual process of converting the latent dream thoughts to the manifest dream aspect was termed by Freud the dream work. We might call it masking or coding what the dream is actually about. In interpreting the dream, we must go through the reverse process and unmask or decode the motif to arrive at its theme. Can you give me an example? Obviously. Right? Let me do an audio check really quickly. Very good. It's all working fine. Okay, so here is an example. Freud's book teems with examples. That means there are quite a few examples in his book. But we can construct a simple and very Freudian example of ours for ourselves. Let us say a young man dreams that he has given two balloons. He is given two balloons by his female cousin. Seriously? Come on. Yes. Go on. Try to interpret the dream yourself. Hmm. There's a manifest dream. Just like you said, the young man gets two balloons from his female cousin. Carry on. You said the scenario is always from the previous day. So he had been at the fair the day before, or maybe he saw a picture of balloons in the newspaper. It's possible, says Alberto. But he need only have seen the word balloon or something that reminded him of a balloon. So now we are in the wild, wild west. Anything is possible. But what are the latent dream thoughts that the dream is really about? What is it? What is it? You are the interpreter. Maybe he just wanted a couple of balloons, said Sophie. No, that won't work. You're right about the dream being a wish fulfillment, but a young man would hardly have an ardent wish for a couple of balloons. And if he had, he wouldn't need to dream about them. Wonderfully put. I think I've got it. He really wants his cousin, and the two balloons are her breasts. Indeed. Welcome to the world of Freudian reasoning. Yes, that's a much more likely explanation, as it presupposes that he had experienced his wish as an embarrassment. In a way, our dreams make a lot of detours, right? That's what Sophie is asking. Yes, Freud believed that the dream was a disguised fulfillment of a repressed wish. But exactly what we have repressed can have changed considerably since Freud was a doctor in Vienna. However, the mechanism of disguised dream content can still be intact. Yes, I see. Right? So the repression, what we repress, depends on the conditions under which we live. That's what he's saying, because the society's moral compass and what is acceptable was not, that keeps changing, right? The the disguised dream content, nevertheless, can still be intact, right? So the underlying desire is the same; those are same. What gets covered, what gets veiled, what gets spoken, and what gets repressed might change depending upon the external circumstances. Yes, I see. Freud's psychoanalysis was extremely important in the 1920s, especially for the treatment of certain psychiatric patients. His theory of the unconscious was also very significant for art and literature. Artists became interested in people's unconscious mental life, Sophie asked. So Alberto is replying, exactly so. Although this had already become a predominant aspect of literature in the last decade of the 19th century, before Freud's psychoanalysis was known, right? So there were already people dwelling into the psychoanalysis of human beings in art and literature as well. It became important, but then came Freud's psychoanalysis, right? So then it became even more important. It merely shows that the appearance of Freud's psychoanalysis at that particular time in the 1890s was no coincidence. You mean it was in the spirit of the times? Asked Sophie. Freud himself did not claim to have discovered phenomena such as repression, defense mechanisms, or rationalization. He was simply the first to apply these human experiences to psychiatry. He was also a master at illustrating his theories with literary examples. But as I mentioned, from the 1920s, Freud's psychoanalysis had a more direct influence on art and literature. So essentially, what Alberto is saying is one influenced the other. It's very hard sometimes in history to draw a timeline and say X influenced Y, right? Because when there is influence, there is an exchange, right? There is an exchange of ideas. So the terminology becomes very common. So it's very hard to say which came first, who invented the term, right? A retro analysis in this kind of situation, unless there is extreme amount of documentation, is very difficult. Okay, happens in the Indian philosophy all the time. You know, so things like, okay, who came up with this idea that life is suffering, uh, this whole Maya principle and all that, right? They say Buddhists. Some argue that Buddhists came up with it first, right? Some people say the Advaitins came up with it first. Suffice to say, there was a lot of discussion and argument, right? Um, I, for one, believe, for example, that it was the Indian philosophy before even the Buddhism took off, right? Here, Alberto is saying that some of Freud's ideas were ideas of the times, right? The ideas were there in conversation during that time. Freud just showed how you can apply them to psychiatry, right? And once Freud applied it, because the artists and the literary people were interested in the psychoanalysis of the human mind or the psychology of the human mind to be projected onto their art, they freely borrowed it. It became very important because Freud became very popular. They incorporated it straight into their art and literature. Okay. So from the 1920s, Freud's psychoanalysis had a more direct influence on art and literature. So now Sophie is asking, in what sense? Poets and painters, especially the surrealists, attempted to exploit the power of the unconscious in their work. What are surrealists? Right? Good question, Sophie. The word surrealism comes from the French and it means super realism. In 1924, Andre Breton published a surrealistic manifesto claiming that the art should come from the unconscious. The artist should thus derive the freest possible inspiration from his dream images and strive towards a super realism in which the boundaries between dream and reality were dissolved. For an artist, too, it can be necessary to break the censorship of the unconscious and let words and images have free play. So, for you to have imagination, some people do even today believe that for you to be creative or imagine something new, you'll have to break the existing barriers. But then, one of the challenges that I have for these kinds of thought, for people who propose this kind of theory, is you are conflating between a good idea that emerges from breaking barriers with breaking barriers itself is a good idea, basically, right? So there are all kinds of garbage theories that people put forward, or even worse, they oppose existing norms just for the sake of opposing them without any higher level thought process, right? Saying that what automatically goes against the existing norm is something that is creative or better. Okay, disagree 100%, 500% with that kind of a theory. Okay, you know who I'm referring to when I say this. Freud demonstrated, okay, I can see that. Sophie says, okay, she's agreeing partially. So, in a sense, Freud demonstrated that there is an artist in everyone. A dream is, after all, a little work of art, and there are new dreams every night. Okay. In order to interpret his patient's dreams, Freud often had to work his way through a dense language of symbols. Rather, in a way, we interpret a picture of a literary text. And we dream every single night, asked Sophie. Recent research shows that we dream for about 20% of our sleeping hours, that is between 1 and 2 hours each night. If we are disturbed during our dream phases, we become nervous and irritable. This means nothing less than that everybody has a innate need to give artistic expression to his or her existential situation. After all, it is ourselves that our dreams are about. We are the directors. We set up the scenario and play all the roles. Absolutely 100% correct. A person who says he does not understand art doesn't know himself very well. So Sophie says, I see that. Freud also delivered impressive evidence of the wonders of the human mind. His work with patients convinced him that we retain everything we have seen and experienced somewhere deep in our consciousness. And all these impressions can be brought to light again. When we experience a memory lapse and a bit later have it on a tip of our tongue and then later still suddenly remember it, we are talking about something which has lain in the unconscious, lain with somewhere lying around somewhere in the unconscious and suddenly slips through the half open door to the consciousness. But it takes a while sometimes, said Sophie. All artists are aware of that. But then suddenly It's as if all doors and all drawers fly open. Everything comes tumbling out by itself, and we can find all the words and images we need. That is when we have lifted the lid, so to speak, of the unconscious. We can call it inspiration, Sophie. It feels as if we, it feels as if what we are drawing or writing is something coming from the outside source. Okay, this is what some people refer to as the flow. Okay, or at least one form of flow. Right? People, it became very popular. I think about 10 years ago or 15 years ago. You do your best work when you are in flow. Basically, that means that you're not thinking about anything. It's as if somebody else is coming and doing it. Okay, and there's one example of this in the Mahabharata where Arjuna says, 13th day or the day after his son dies. It's as if somebody, and he has to take care of Saindava and all that. It's as if somebody is sitting in front of me and doing the war, and I am not the one uh, projecting the arrows and whatever it is. Right? It's the same kind of feeling. You know, once all the lids are out, and then you are in touch with that unconscious, it feels as if we are drawing or writing is coming from some outside source. Right? This is what some people say. Ramanujan had thought about mathematics so much that it felt like the insights, because a lot of Ramanujan's results, there's no proof, right? He just wrote down the result, but the he attributed it to some divine intervention. Some people say he was just getting in touch with his unconscious. All the lids had come out because he was so immersed in the subject. Anyway, it must be a wonderful feeling, said Sophie. But you must have experienced it yourself. You can frequently observe inspiration at work in children who are overtired. They are sometimes so extremely overtired that they seem to be wide awake. Suddenly, they start telling a story as if they are finding words they haven't yet learned. They have, though, the words and ideas have lain. They have, though, that means that they do have the words. Where have they been? The words and the ideas have lain latent, in quotes, in their consciousness. But now, when all caution and all censorship have let go, they are surfacing. It can also be important for an artist not to let reason and reflection control a more or less unconscious expression. Shall I tell you a little story to illustrate this? So that means what Alberto is saying is sometimes it's important for an artist to be able to have that open-ended, unbridled expression, right? Unrestrained expression, right? So that they can get more in touch with the unconscious, so that they can find the words. The creativity comes from there, basically. Right? Shall I tell you a story to illustrate this? Sure, says Sophie. It's a very serious and a very sad story, said Alberto. Sophie says, okay, she's ready for it. Once upon a time, there was a centipede that was amazingly good at dancing with all 100 legs. All the creatures of the forest gathered to watch every time the centipede dance. Centipede is like a, it's like a, what do you call it? It's a, it has 100 legs basically, right? I mean, you must have seen all kinds of centipedes, like a caterpillar kind of thing. They just crawl on the ground. Okay, all the creatures of the forest gathered to watch every time the centipede danced, and they were all duly impressed by the exquisite dance. But there was one creature that didn't like watching the centipede dance. That was the tortoise. Okay, it was probably just envious, said Sophie. How can I get the centipede to stop dancing? Thought the tortoise. He couldn't just say he didn't like the dance. Neither could he say he danced better himself. That would obviously be untrue. So he devised a fiendish plan. Fiendish means very devious kind of plan. Kutra, devious plan. It's a, uh, it's a shady strategy. Let's hear it. He sat down and wrote a letter to the centipede. Oh, incomparable centipede, he wrote. I am a devoted admirer of your exquisite dancing. I must know how to go about it when you dance. How you go about it when you dance. Is it that you lift your left leg number 28 and then your right leg number 39? Or do you begin by lifting your right leg number 17 before you lift your left leg number 44? I await your answer in breathless anticipation. Yours truly, Tortoise. How mean, said Sophie. When the centipede read the letter, she immediately began to think about what she actually did when she danced. Which leg did she lift first? And which leg next? When you think, what do you think happened in the end? Sophie says, the centipede never danced again. That's exactly what happened. And that's the way it goes when imagination gets strangled by reasoned deliberation. This is a beautiful line. Okay. There are some jokers that we know that are trying to apply logic to poetry, right? There are some works of poetry, right, in ancient history. You try to look at it logically and try to apply science to it, you are going to fail miserably. Why? You lose the spirit of the poetry. That's exactly what happened. Again, Alberto, right? And that's the way it goes when imagination gets strangled. Look at the term strangled by reasoned deliberation. That was a sad story, said Sophie. All right, Alberto is moving on. It is important for an artist to be able to let go. The surrealists tried to exploit this by putting themselves into a state where things just happened by themselves. They had a sheet of white paper in front of them and they began to write without thinking about what they wrote. Okay, they called it automatic writing. The expression originally comes from spiritualism, where a medium believed that a departed spirit was guiding the pen. But I thought we would talk more about that kind of thing tomorrow. Okay, said Alberto. I'd like that, said Sophie. In one sense, the surrealist artist is also a medium. That is to say, a means or a link. So you're just an instrument. There is a flow happening from somewhere, and it is just getting expressed. You are just the instrument or the medium through which it is flowing. He is a medium of his own unconscious. But perhaps there is an element of the unconscious in every creative process. Or what do we actually mean by creativity? Okay. So that's what Alberto said. Even if you're cooking, when you're ironing, when you're doing any mundane task, right? Are you just a medium for the flow to happen? Can you get in touch with the unconscious? Right? Can you be the unconscious? Can you feel it? Can you experience it? All right. I have no idea. Isn't it when you create something? Said Sophie. Fair enough. And that happens in a delicate interplay between imagination and reason. Yes. The beauty of the human mind is this interplay between imagination and reason. Become too rational, you lose touch with the unconscious. Become too dreamy, you're always in the unconscious, you lose touch with the reality. Okay? This is the crux of the human experience or the human condition. He is a medium of his own unconscious, but perhaps there is an element of unconscious in every creative process. For what we do, we actually, for what do we do? What do we actually mean by creativity? So Sophie is saying, I have no idea. Isn't it when you create something? She asked. Fair enough. And that happens in a delicate interplay between imagination and reason. But all too frequently, reason throttles the imagination. And that is serious because without imagination, nothing really new will ever be created. I believe imagination is like a Darwinian system, right? I'm sorry, but I didn't get that, says Sophie. Well, Darwinism holds that nature's mutants arise one after the other, but only a few of them can be used. Only some of them get the right to live. So, Sophie asked, that's how it is when we have an inspiration and get masses of new ideas. Thought mutants occur in the consciousness one after the other, at least if we refrain from censoring ourselves too much. But only some of these thoughts can be used. Here, reason comes into its own. So the thought comes first, and then reason puts a gate saying this can be used, this cannot be used. Okay, so it's some kind of a throttle or a regulating mechanism, right? It too has a vital function, the throttling. When the day's catch is laid on the table, you must not forget to be selective. Okay, this is a metaphor, obviously. He's talking about catching fish, but he's referring to the ideas. That's not a bad comparison, said Sophie. Imagine if everything that strikes us were allowed to pass our lips, not to speak of jumping off our notepads, out of our desk drawers. The world would sink under the weight of casual impulses and no selection would have taken place. Okay, so there is this process even in when you talk about innovation and coming up with new ideas. Yeah, Vermaclus, hello sir. When you're talking about even innovation in the corporate sense, there is this process called variant selection retention, VSR process, right? So when a group of people sit together to come up with new ideas, by itself it's a bit of a structured process which kills the creativity to a certain extent, but nevertheless, that's how a lot of companies do it, right? So people sit together and then there is a phase where they're just generating ideas. That's the variance phase. As in like you're just generating new ideas without any um, real um, gating or filtering, right? Some people call it this whole design thinking or whatever it is, right? So you get a people together, set up people together, and then you imagine what is possible, the art of the possible, they call it, right? I mean, really, it's not there, but it is paying some kind of lip service to exactly what Alberto is saying. But then you put everything on the table, all the new ideas, and then you select what ideas are appropriate to be followed upon, right? And then retention. Once you select, you retain the idea, you fund it, you invest in it, you grow it, and then you eventually harvest the outcome of it post investment. Okay. Okay. Imagine if everything that strikes us were to pass our lips, blah, blah, etc. The world would sink under the weight of casual impulses and no selection would have taken place. So it's reason that chooses between all these ideas. So Sophie is trying to draw that conclusion. Yes, don't you think so, Sophie? Maybe the imagination creates what is new, but the imagination does not make the actual selection. The imagination does not compose. A composition, and every work of art is one, is created in a wondrous interplay between imagination and reason, or between mind and reflection. For there will always be an element of chance in the creative process. You have to turn the sheep loose before you can start to herd them again, basically. Alberto sat quite still, staring out of the window. While he sat there, Sophie suddenly noticed a crowd of brightly colored Disney figures down by the lake. That's Goofy, she exclaimed, and Donald Duck and his nephews. Look, Alberto, there's Mickey Mouse. And it, then Alberto turned towards her. He turned towards her. Yes, it's very sad, child. What do you mean? Asked Sophie. Here we are, being made the helpless victims of the major's flock of sheep. But it's my own fault, of course. I was the one who started talking about free association of ideas. You certainly don't have to blame yourself, said Sophie. I was going to say something about the importance of imagination to us philosophers. In order to think new thoughts, we must be bold enough to let ourselves go. But right now, he's going a bit far. So essentially, what he's saying is the major has put in all these Disney characters coming through in the middle of a very serious conversation. Just because you say you have to let your thoughts go does not mean you have to start thinking about Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse. Don't worry about it, said Sophie. I was about to mention the importance of reflection. And here we are presented with this lurid imbecility. Okay. He should be ashamed of himself. They're blaming the major. Are you being ironic now? Asked Sophie. It's he who is ironic, not me. But I have one comfort that this is the whole cornerstone of my that is the whole cornerstone of my plan. Now I'm really confused, said Sophie. We have talked about dreams. There's a touch of irony about that too. For what are we but Major's dream images? Ah, but there's still one thing he hasn't counted on. What's that? Asked Sophie. Maybe he's embarrassingly aware of his own dream. He's aware of everything we say and do, just as the dreamer remembers the dream's manifest dream aspect. It is he who wields it with his pen. But even if he remembers everything we say to each other, he's still not quite awake. What do you mean? Asked Sophie. He does not know the latent dream thoughts, Sophie. He forgets that this too is a disguised dream. You're talking so strangely. So now Alberto is applying the full. When you apply the full manifest Freud's framework, people can start sounding very strange and weird. By the way, okay. So you're talking so strangely, said Sophie. The major thinks so too. That is because he does not understand his own dream language. Let us be thankful for that. That gives us a tiny bit of elbow room, you see. And with this elbow room, we shall soon fight our way out of his muddy consciousness like water voles frisking about in the sun on a summer day. Do you think we'll make it? Asked Sophie. We must. Within a couple of days, I shall give you a new horizon. Then the major will no longer know where the water voles are or where they will pop up next time. But even if we are only dream images, I'm still my mother's daughter. And it's 5 o'clock. I have to go home to Captain's Bend and prepare for the garden party, said Sophie. Can you do me a little favor on the way home? What? Asked Sophie. Try to attract a little attention. Try to get the major to keep his eye on you all the way home. Try and think about him when you get home, and he'll think about you too. What good will that do? Asked Sophie. Then I can carry on undisturbed with my work on the secret plan. I'm going to dive down into Major's unconscious. Unconscious. Okay. That's where I'll be until we meet again. So Alberto is saying the Major is aware. That's why he is writing with a pen this entire story. But then there is an unconscious part of the Major's dream that the Major himself is not aware of. That Alberto is now going to immerse himself until Sophie comes back. With that, I think again, tip my hat to Jostein for covering Freud in this one. Very nice. She threaded the needle almost, right, without really going too far into this whole extremes like Odious complex and Electra complex, blah blah, etc. All these things, right? That those are the terms that are being used in these days. I'm sure she has heard about them as well. At the same time, she presented Freud in a very understandable manner. You can make a mess out of this, right? But well done to the author. She kept it very simple, very clean. At the same time, she did present all the ideas in a very succinct and understandable manner. You can read this chapter 5 times, and you'll probably get 5 different ways of understanding it, or 5 different ways you can digest it. Right. With that said, I'll probably wait for another minute. If anybody wants to join, I'll again give the link. But not much to discuss here as such. We can talk about Freud. Freud is the topic. So if you're interested in talking about Freud and how the author sort of dealt with that entire topic, please click the link and join. If you do not, if nobody shows up in a minute or two, then I'll close, right? Because it's already been a long session. I usually keep it to 1 hour, 15 minutes. If you want to talk about me, that's off the table. Go interpret your own dreams. I'm nobody to give you any insight. All right. So with that said, I just wanted to see where we are in the book. So the next, I think this is probably the last of the historical perspectives or the philosophies that the author touched upon or the author put in the book. The next chapter's name is Our Own Time. Okay, that's the title of the chapter, and the brief, the summary of the chapter, the line that summarizes the chapter, like all other chapters, is man is condemned to be free. That's what Jostein says. So we'll see how we are condemned to be free. An interesting use of words, but quite fascinating. This entire chapter talks about the tension between imagination and what was that? She said the wondrous interplay between imagination and reason. Okay, I'll leave you with that thought basically. Right, as you delve into your own mind, remember that there's an enormous amount of unknown in your own mind. You can get caught up in mundane, repetitive tasks and completely ignore that unconscious. At the same time, spend too much time thinking about something without really having the instruments to think about it. Even imagination requires some instrumentation to function properly, right? Unbridled thinking, uh, uncontrolled imagination, or imagination without any reason. The selection process of what ideas come to the mind and being aware of what thoughts are coming to your mind. These are all the things that as adults people should practice so that they can practically get through life without going to one extreme or another, right? Cut all imagination and it will be a very boring life. Cut all reason, and then you'll be stuck in a world of imagination with no manifestation. Okay, that I will end the session. Thanks everybody who tuned in and whoever are going to listen to this in the future. Sherekan Garu, howdy. Okay, so that's that. Thank you very much. We'll see you in the next session.